Hello and welcome. In today's video, we're going to explore one of the most misunderstood and, at times, most controversial aspects of South Asian religion, Tantra. To guide us, I'll be drawing on Hugh B. Urban's fascinating book, The Power of Tantra, which takes us deep into one of its oldest and most important traditions, the worship of the goddess Kamakya at her temple in Assam in the far northeast of India. The image you see on the screen in front of you is not actually of the goddess Kamakya, it is of the goddess Kali, arguably one of the more recognizable deities or images associated with Tantra. And it's important at the outset to recognize that Tantra is not one single thing. It's an umbrella term for a wide range of diverse teachings and practices. But in this video, based on Urban's book, we're going to focus specifically on what's often called the left-hand path of Tantra. In broad terms, spiritual traditions around the world often speak of two complementary approaches to the sacred, the so-called left-hand and right-hand paths. The right-hand path tends to follow the accepted norms of religion and society. It works within boundaries of purity, law, and tradition, and often interprets potentially transgressive elements symbolically rather than literally. The left-hand path, by contrast, deliberately pushes beyond these boundaries. It embraces what is normally forbidden or impure, not for its own sake, but to transform it into a source of spiritual power. In the context of Tantra, this might involve literal use of taboo substances, ritual transgressions, and the overturning of conventional ideas concerning purity and pollution. In Assam, at the Kamakya temple, it is this left-hand tradition that has been most prominent, a form of Tantra at once deeply rooted in both indigenous culture, but also connected to a wider Indian and even global understanding of the spiritual power found at the margins. Tantra is a word that, for many people, conjures up images of exotic rituals, esoteric symbols, and perhaps most strongly in the modern West, ideas about sacred sexuality. But as Urban's research makes clear, the reality is far more complex, and in some ways far more challenging than those popular images suggest. Now, this presentation isn't going to cover everything in Urban's book. There are sections in his book, for example, on gender, imperialism, and the modern world. For the purposes of this video, we're simply going to be focusing on esoteric sexual rite in left-hand Tantra as it is found in the state of Assam. You can find a link to the book in the video description, and I'd encourage viewers to read it. I certainly enjoyed it whilst preparing this video. In terms of its reputation, no aspect of Indian religion has been more surrounded by confusion than Tantra. For European colonizers, Orientalist scholars, and Christian missionaries of the Victorian era, Tantra was, quote, generally seen as the worst, most degenerate and depraved example of all the worst tendencies in the Indian mind, a pathological mixture of religion and sensuality, end quote. It was, in their eyes, a symptom of moral decay, a strange blend of mysticism and the erotic. Even today, Tantra can appear exotic or unsettling, not just to outsiders, but also to many within India itself. Urban's book focuses on one of the oldest, most important, and yet little studied tantric traditions, namely the goddess Kamakya and the worship at her temple in Assam. This temple has, for centuries, been infamous for its quite radical forms of tantric practice, including, controversially, the regular offering of animal sacrifice and, according to some accounts, esoteric sexual rites. Assam itself occupies a unique place in the Indian imagination. In colonial narratives, it was portrayed as, quote, the most exotic, dangerous, effeminate region of the subcontinent, end quote, and more specifically as the homeland of Tantra's perverse rites. Such portrayals, combining fascination with fear, become a convenient justification for British colonial control. If this was a land of dangerous magic, human sacrifice, and sexual license, then surely the reasoning went it needed firm imperial rule. The author, Urban, uses the tradition of Tantra in Assam as a kind of microcosm for looking at how Tantra's role has shifted across South Asian history. The Assamese form of Tantra is quite different from, for example, the highly philosophical Brahmanic traditions of, say, Kashmir Shaivism or South Indian Sri Vidya, traditions which possibly in the future I can dedicate videos to. Instead, it is heavily infused with non-Hindu, indigenous elements drawn from the tribal cultures of the Northeast. If we just take a few steps back to zero in on the concept of Tantra, one of the author's first points is that Tantra is not a single monolithic tradition. Like so many terms in religion, it's a broad, ambiguous word covering a wide variety of diverse, often conflicting practices, texts, and beliefs, which will vary from place to place. In the modern West, Tantra is often reduced to its specifically sexual elements, yoga workshops that promise better intimacy, for instance. But this, the author makes clear, is a distortion. While sexual rights do exist in some branches, the reality is much more nuanced. In fact, Urban suggests that the real otherness of Tantra lies less in sex and more in ritual transgression, the use of substances considered impure, the performance of animal sacrifices, and the incorporation of indigenous practices lying quite outside orthodox Hindu norms. This is why even within India itself, Tantra remains a controversial stream. The author offers a useful way to think about Tantra through two key Sanskrit concepts. Sanskrit, of course, being the language of the sacred scriptures in India. Kama, meaning desire, and Shakti, meaning power. Most Indian traditions view desire as something to be overcome, an obstacle on the path to liberation and the root of our suffering. Tantra, however, takes a different approach. It seeks to harness, transform, and redirect desire towards both worldly power and ultimately spiritual awakening. This brings us to the topic of sacred geography. Hindu Tantra developed a network of sacred sites across India, often called seats of power. Kamakya in Assam is perhaps the most important in the northeast. Kamakya herself is a deeply ambivalent goddess. She has two faces, the loving, sensual mother, but equally the fierce, terrifying destroyer. These two aspects are not in contradiction. They are two sides of the same divine reality, and they appear again and again in her various myths and rituals. In her honor, devotees perform both sensual rites and acts of sacrifice at these various sites of power. This brings us to the topic of sacrifice. Modern discussions of Tantra often center on sexuality, especially in the modern West, but the author Urban reminds us that sacrifice, especially the offering of blood, is at least as central. Sacrifice in general has been a recurring theme in Indian religion for over 3,500 years. From the elaborate animal sacrifices of the early Vedas to the internal sacrifices of meditation in the Upanishads to the battle sacrifices in the great epics, and even the self-offering of devotion in the Bhagavad Gita, one of the flagship scriptures of the Hindu religion. Tantra is in many ways a late but fascinating variation on this theme. Even as animal sacrifice gradually disappeared from mainstream Hinduism, partly due to Buddhist and Jain critiques and the growing ideal of ahimsa, the principle of non-violence, it nevertheless persisted in certain tantric traditions. The Kalika Purana, a key Assamese text, for example, goes so far as to declare that, quote, sacrifice is the origin and foundation of everything. Indeed, sacrifice is everything, end quote. At Kamakya, blood is understood as the vehicle of the goddess's power. The temple is even linked to the belief that once a year the goddess menstruates and her blood flows from the earth to nourish the entire world. In orthodox or mainstream Hindu law, menstrual blood, like all bodily fluids, is considered powerful, but also dangerously impure. Touching a menstruating woman is equated with touching an outcast or a corpse. But, in contrast, the left-hand path turns this view upside down. Here, what is normally a source of pollution is transformed into a source of divine energy. Animal sacrifice at Kamakya is not a relic of the past. It is central to worship. Unlike the Vedic tradition, which used pure domestic animals and avoided visible bloodshed, the left-hand tradition here prefers wild, dangerous animals. The sacrifice is performed by beheading inside the sacred enclosure, and the severed head becomes a focal point of the rite. This deliberate inversion of Vedic norms is key to the left-hand path. It collapses the boundaries between purity and impurity, order and chaos, to unleash the raw force of Shakti, or power. Now, on the topic of power, Tantra is not solely about liberation from the cycle of rebirth, especially in its left-hand form. It's also about power, and not just spiritual power in some abstract sense. It's about the ability to act in the world, this world in the here and now, to influence events, and to command respect. In many periods of Indian history, Tantra has been closely tied to kingship and political authority. Shakti, power, is not merely an inward mystical energy. It's the very life force that sustains the cosmos, the state, and the social order. In the state of Assam, the worship of Kamakya was historically inseparable from the legitimacy of rulers, who are seen as the goddess's male counterpart. This makes sense when you remember that, in the left-hand view, spiritual power and worldly power are not separate. Mastery in one sphere reinforces mastery in the other. And so again, here we can see exemplified one of the key differences between Tantra in general, but specifically the left-hand path, compared with mainstream or orthodox Vedic spirituality. Because whereas mainstream Vedic religion, Hinduism essentially, is concerned with liberation from this world, Tantra, by contrast, believes that it is very much in and through this world in the here and now that one gains liberation. Liberation isn't in some metaphysical hinterland to come in an imagined afterlife. True liberation from the tantric point of view is to be found in the present, in this world. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that Tantra remains controversial not just in general but within India itself. And perhaps the most controversial aspect of Tantra, especially in its left-hand variety, is its sexual rites. These are often sensationalized in popular imagination and literature, but the reality is far subtler and more symbolic than people think. Most tantric texts, even those aligned with the left-hand path, devote far more space to mantras, meditations, and deity worship than to sexual intercourse. Where sexual rites are described, they are not about erotic pleasure in the modern sense, pleasure for the sake of pleasure. They are instead about generating and consuming male and female sexual fluids as sacred offerings, what the author Urban calls the esoteric counterpart to the public sacrifice of blood. Now, we could have a whole video on the concept of the esoteric, and perhaps we will at some point in the future. But for the purposes of this video, when it comes to the word esoteric, all I'll say is that we mean the inside of things. If we're concerned with the esoteric, we're concerned not with surface appearances, but with their inner significance and meaning. In both cases, the principle is the same. Substances and acts seen as impure are transformed into sources of spiritual force or power. In left-hand Tantra, this may involve literally breaking caste laws, consuming forbidden substances, or engaging in sexual union with partners chosen specifically to defy social norms. You can see why the left-hand school has proven so controversial. The ultimate goal, it's important to note, is not indulgence, certainly not indulgence for the sake of indulgence, but in fact, transcendence. what Urban calls, quote, the overstepping of the very boundary between human and divine, end quote. By confronting and ritualizing specifically what is forbidden, the practitioner bursts through the limitations of the ego, touching the limitless expanse of the infinite. This brings us back to the key difference between right hand and left hand Tantra. The right hand path interprets the transgression of taboos and ritual impurities in a symbolic way. Wine, for example, which is a ritual taboo, wine might stand for divine bliss, meat for the enjoyment of life, sexual union for the merging of self and deity, all to be experienced in meditation within oneself without literal enactment. The left-hand path, however, takes such taboos literally. Wine is drunk, meat is consumed, sexual union is enacted in ritual space, often alongside other highly transgressive acts, such as animal sacrifice. This is not done for shock value or mere sensual pleasure. It is done to access what Urban, the author, calls the power at the margins, the power believed to be inherent in things that exist outside the boundaries of mainstream religion and society. In Assam, left-hand rituals draw directly on non-Hindu tribal traditions, where such acts have long been part of the spiritual landscape. This gives the Kamakya tradition its distinctive flavor. It is, the author recognizes, at once deeply Hindu and yet unmistakably rooted in the indigenous cultures of the Northeast Hills. One of the clearest windows into this quite particular world is a text called the Yoni Tantra, arguably the most sexually explicit of all tantras. I should have mentioned at the beginning that there are a number of meanings behind the term tantra. In one sense, it refers to this quite broad range of different traditions and practices and schools, including the focus of this video, the worship of Kamakya in northeast India. But it also refers, in this case, to a genre of literature. The Yoni Tantra makes the link between sexual union and animal sacrifice explicit, seeing them as two sides of one and the same coin. Both are offerings to the goddess. Both are forms of the so-called secret sacrifice. In the most radical forms of left-hand Tantra described in this text, the Yoni Tantra, the practitioner is free from all social constraints. To quote the text, any foods, any beverages, and relations with any caste are allowed for the tantric hero who has left class and purity behind. End quote. For the practitioner, these acts are not mere indulgence. They are spiritual technology, designed to break the rigid walls of the individual ego. They dismantle the idea of a separate, bounded self, allowing it to dissolve in the infinite. This links to the principle or concept of non-duality. Again, we could have a whole video on this concept alone, but much of Tantra is what can be described broadly as a non-dualistic philosophy. The idea that the separation we experience between self and other, inside and outside, this and that, is merely an appearance. In some sense, it's illusory. It's not the true nature of things. Now, this has some quite profound implications, at least from the tantric view, because if the world is truly non-dual, then surely all of these prohibitions which distinguish between pure and impure, high caste and low caste, are really illusory. If everything is one and the same reality, if it's all one and the same divine consciousness, then surely we can't make such distinctions. The tradition of worshipping the goddess Kamakya in northeast India, this path of power, explores precisely this line of thinking, hence the deliberate but very controlled and calculated transgression of things that otherwise would be considered taboo. To conclude, in The Power of Tantra, Hugh Urban shows us a tradition that defies easy definition. Left-hand Tantra in Assam is sensual and fierce, rooted in local culture, yet connected to broader Indian philosophy, transgressive yet profoundly spiritual. Whether through sacrifice, ritual inversion, or esoteric sexual rites, it seeks to harness the raw forces of desire and power, not to escape the world, but to master it, and finally, to transcend the very limits of the self. Evidently, the left-hand path is certainly not for beginners. Following this school comes with many great dangers. Accordingly, one shouldn't embark on such practices without extensive prior training and preparation. That being said, I believe we owe it to ourselves to study these traditions, however controversial or exotic they may appear, understanding that they form part of and contribute to the complex, checkered, but ever interesting field of religion and spirituality. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, leaving your thoughts in the comments section below. Your support enables this channel to continue growing. I look forward to seeing you again in the next video.